أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So inshallah we'll be continuing where we left off Uthman radiallahu anhu, but I know a lot of people are new, and since it's been like over a month, we're going to start with a small recap of his life. So as I was mentioning in the last halaqah, we went over the lineage of Uthman radiallahu anhu, as we did the other Sahaba radiallahu anhum ajma'in. So really quickly, where he connects with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam is Umayyah ibn Abd Shams. So Abd Shams was one of the sons of Abd Manaf, and so Abd Manaf is the person who connects Uthman with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So until that, it is Uthman ibn Affan ibn Abi al-As ibn Umayyah ibn Abd Shams ibn Abd Manaf. And he's also connected to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam by his grandmother Umm Hakim al-Bayda bint al-Muttalib. So al-Muttalib meaning that she is the aunt of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So the grandmother of Uthman is the aunt of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam on the dad's side. And he was also known by his most famous nickname, which was, does anyone know his most famous nickname? In Arabic it's Dhu'n-Nurayn. So it means the possessor of the two lights. And this is because he was married to two daughters of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And no other Sahaba had this honor. And those two daughters were Ruqayyah and Umm Kulthum radiallahu anhum. So something else that is narrated about him is that he was fair-skinned, he was of medium height, and he was really beautiful. And so there is a narration from Osama ibn Zayd ibn al-Harith radiallahu anhu, who narrates that he went to the house of Uthman when he was married to Ruqayyah. And when he saw them, he came back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked him that what did you think of them? Meaning the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning Uthman radiallahu anhu and his wife Ruqayyah. And then Osama ibn Zayd ibn al-Haritha replied to him, I've never seen a couple look more beautiful than them. So both Ruqayyah radiallahu anha and Uthman radiallahu anhu, they were very, very beautiful. MashaAllah. And this was an honor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him. He was also a very shy person, and because of his character and how he was in the Quraysh, it is said that the Quraysh, they loved Uthman. They absolutely loved Uthman. And there's a lullaby, a type of lullaby that the moms would recite to their babies to have them go to sleep. And they would say, أُحِبَّكَ وَالرَّحْمَنِ حُبَّ قُرَيْشِ لِأُثْمَانِ. That by Allah, I love you like the Quraysh love Uthman. And this was because of his character. And even before he had become Muslim, it is said that he was one of those who never drank and never prostrated to an idol. And we know that this was the same for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And who else? Which other Sahaba do we know this of? Yeah, that's right. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu also is said to have never prostrated nor drunk any alcohol. And what else that we know of his life pre-Islam was that he was very affluent. He had lots of money and he had gained lots of wealth. And this was another one of the barakah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given to him. Another one of the honors. And it is said that him and Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, that no one can compete with them in terms of quantity of wealth. In terms of quantity, no one could compete with these two Sahaba. That whenever the opportunity came, they would always give the most amounts of money to the Prophet ﷺ and to the cause of the Muslims. And now really quickly, going over the recap, his conversion to Islam, he was 34 when he converted, and he was one of the earliest converts. And it is said that he was the fourth amongst the men. The other was Abu Bakr, was another Sahaba, Ali radiallahu anhu, and who was said to be the third male? Not Bilal. It was Zayd ibn Haritha. Zayd ibn Haritha, the adopted son of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so he met with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and took the Shahada. His life in Mecca, so I'm going to quickly recap over his marriages. So he was married first to Ruqayyah, and the Prophet ﷺ had given him Ruqayyah, and before her, he had not married. And so when the condition of the Muslims had gotten worse, he migrated with Ruqayyah to Abyssinia. And then later on, they came back to Mecca when they realized that the condition of the Muslims had gotten a bit better. However, this was just hearsay. This was a rumor that went on. And so because of this rumor, they ended up coming back. And then they said that since we're already here, why should we migrate back? But we'll just remain here. In Medina, after he made the Hijrah with his wife Ruqayyah radiallahu anha, it is said that he was one of the Muhajirun who did not need any sort of monetary aid. So we know that the other Sahaba, there's companionship that was made between them and the Ansar. And this is why the Ansar were called the helpers. However, Uthman radiallahu anhu, because of his business acumen and his expertise in trade, he didn't need any help monetarily wise. So he was able to start a business again in Medina, and alhamdulillah, by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it became successful as well. And there came an event in Medina where I mentioned, where one of the wells, it was called Bi'r Ruma, the well of Ruma, became difficult to access for the Muslims and the people of Medina, because the person who owned this well, he made the cost of even a bucket of water really too much for the people, for the Muslims. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man yashtari bi'r Ruma, fiyaj'alu dalwahu ma'a dila'il muslimin, bikhayrin lahu minha fil jannah." That who will buy the well of Ruma and dip his bucket in it alongside the bucket of the Muslims in return for one better than it in paradise. And the man who came forth in this instance and in further instances was Uthman radiallahu anhu, and it is said that he purchased it for 10,000 dirhams. And now moving on to the Battle of Badr, it is said that he was not allowed to participate in this battle because the Prophet ﷺ told him not to. So he had come out ready with his armor, with everything ready, but he was stopped. Why? Because his wife Ruqayyah had become sick. And she was the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ. And he said to Uthman, he said, "No, you will stay here and take care of Ruqayyah." And it just happened so that when the battle was won, and the day the Prophet ﷺ arrived with the army, in that morning was the janazah of Ruqayyah. So she had passed away on that same day when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given the Muslims victory. And this made Uthman radiallahu anhu very sad. It made him very sad because this was his wife and she was the daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so the Prophet saw the sadness in him. And with her, he also had a son as well. And so thinking about this, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam then again goes to Uthman and he gives to him another daughter of his, Umm Kulthum radiallahu anha. And I mentioned that there was hikmah, that there was wisdom in this. Does anyone remember the wisdom I said? In giving Uthman radiallahu anhu the sister of Ruqayyah while he has a son. So I mentioned that there is a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he says, "Al-Khalatu bi-manzilatil that the khala is like the mother." And so for this young child who was just born, the best person who could act like his mother figure, who could act like a mom to him, was his khala. And his khala was Umm Kulthum. And so this was one of the other wisdoms in the Prophet ﷺ marrying Uthman to his daughter. And then we move on to the Battle of Uhud. It is said that during the Battle of Uhud, when the tide of the battle changed and the Muslims became the losing side, when they started incurring lots of casualties, it is said that some of the Muslims, they turned their backs and they sort of retreated. They turned their backs and they retreated to a place. And of them, it's said that one of them was Uthman radiallahu anhu. That when the battle turned really bad, as honestly all of us would, he turned his back and he sort of retreated in that battle. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals an ayah where he says, this is in the 3rd surah, he says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ تَوَلَّوْا مِنْكُمْ يَوْمَ الْتَقَى الْجَمْعَانِ إِنَّمَا اسْتَزَلَّهُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ بِبَعْدِ مَا كَسَبُوا وَلَقَدْ عَفَى اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ حَلِيمٌ. That indeed those believers, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says believers, who fled on the day when the two armies met, were made to slip by shaitan because of their misdeeds. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has pardoned them. Surely Allah is all forgiving, most forbearing. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself had forgiven all of those on the battle of Uhud who had turned their backs. And then I mentioned the Treaty of Hudaybiyah before we got to the Khilafah. I mentioned the Treaty of Hudaybiyah where the Muslims went to do Umrah and they were stopped by the Quraysh. And the Quraysh, they said, we won't let you do Umrah this year, but next year you can come back and we'll let you do Umrah. And they also gave them so many conditions that it seemed to be a loss for the Muslims. And the person who was sent to negotiate with the Quraysh was Uthman radiallahu anhu. And one of the reasons I mentioned was because of how beloved he was to the Quraysh. And so the Muslims and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew that he would be treated more fairly than the others, as well as they might be more willing to converse with him, and they would not hurt him as they would someone else. And so Uthman radiallahu anhu, while he was talking to them, a rumor spread amongst the Muslims because of how long it was taking him and for the Quraysh to do the negotiations. So it was taking so long that a rumor spread that the Quraysh had killed Uthman radiallahu anhu. And as we know, rumors, when they start, they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's just no end to them. And so this reached the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well. And so when the Prophet heard this, he said that if this is indeed the case, then we will fight the Quraysh even if all of us are to die. Because this would most likely have been certain death. Because they came without weapons. They came to do Umrah, they had their sacrificial animals, and maybe just a dagger to sacrifice those animals. But they didn't bring their armor because this was one of the reasons they came unequipped, so that the Quraysh didn't think that they were there to fight. That they came on peaceful terms just to do the Umrah. And then all the people that were there at Hudaybiyah, pretty much all of them, they came and they gave the bay'ah to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this came to be known as the Bay'atul Ridwan. And it's said to be that Ridwan because either the place or a tree there was called Ridwan. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes in a verse in the Quran, لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ يُبَايِعُونَكَ تَحْتَ الشَّجَرَةِ. That indeed Allah was pleased with the believers when they pledged their allegiance to you, O Prophet, under the tree. And so again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying again that He is pleased with the believers who pledged allegiance, the Sahaba radiallahu anhum ajma'in. And then I mentioned this point because there are amongst Muslims people who say things about the Sahaba. And so this is why we should remain wary of them. Know that it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has affirmed in the Quran the high maqam, the high status of the Sahaba. And since Uthman radiallahu anhu wasn't there, he was with the Quraysh. And this is why I'm mentioning this story once again. It is said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam placed his hand out like this, and then he took his own hand and he placed it on top of his hand, and he said, "This is the pledge of Uthman radiallahu anhu." And why this is such a high barakat, a high ni'mah that is granted to him, is because this is the hand of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so even metaphorically, the symbol of this, that his hand is on top, that the hand of Uthman is on top the hand of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is perhaps the greatest honor that is given to him. And another instance I mentioned was again when the masjid it became small because the number of Muslims was increasing at an exponential rate in Medina. And so the Prophet ﷺ said that we need to expand this masjid and we need to buy this plot of land that is behind the masjid. And the person that stood up again, it was Uthman radiallahu anhu. And he said that I will pay for the expansion of this masjid. And so the masjid was expanded. In another instance, it is said that he gave a whole caravan of food fully loaded and wealth to the Prophet ﷺ and to the Muslims, and he said that this is a donation from me to you, and you may do with it as you wish. And after this, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ma darra ibn Affan ma amal ba'da al-yawm." that no act of Uthman can harm him after what he has done today. And so this was another virtue of Uthman radiallahu anhu. And so this is where we left off last time. This is the mini recap. And now to go over his Khilafah. And I mentioned that before he became the Khalifa, there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ told Uthman, he said that, "O Uthman," I'll say in Arabic first, he says, "Ya Uthman, إِنَّهُ لَعَلَى اللَّهِ يُقَمِيسُكَ قَمِيسًا فَإِنْ أَرَادُكَ عَلَى خَلْعِهِ فَلَا تَخْلَعْهُ لَهُمْ." That, O Uthman, indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may give you a garment, and if they wish to take that garment off of you, then do not take it off for them. And this is where I left off, and I said that if anyone has the time, that they should look up the meaning of this hadith. So does anyone have the meaning of this hadith? Yeah, go ahead, Kasi.
My understanding of it was he wanted to protect the modesty of
So you're saying that when the Prophet ﷺ says that do not take off your garments, that he's referencing to modesty.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is an interpretation. It's not the correct interpretation. So the garments here symbolizes something else. Does anyone want to take another guess? I'll say it one more time and then we'll move on. The Prophet ﷺ says that, "O Uthman, indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may give you a garment, and if they wish to take that garment off of you, then do not take it off for them."
That he's meant to become a Khalifa.
So
and don't give away the Khalifate.
yeah, so that's right. So that is what the hadith is referencing. So the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they understood this hadith as well. And they know that the garments in this hadith is referencing the Khilafah. That he will be given the leadership over the Muslims. That he will become Amir al-Mu'mineen. And the Prophet ﷺ, like subhanAllah, he knew so much of the future events. And there are narrations where he even said that if you knew how much I know, then you would laugh very little and you would cry a lot. Because of the knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given to the Prophet ﷺ. And this was a part of it. That he knew about the fitna that would come during the time of Uthman. And so he was elected as the Khalifa after a shura came. And it was made up of those who were part of the Ashara Mubashara, of the 10 promised paradise. And half of them said that we do not wish to take up the Khilafah. So half of them said that we will give our vote to Uthman. And the other half said that we will give our vote to Ali radiallahu anhu. And then amongst them was the most senior of them, Abdurrahman ibn Auf radiallahu anhu. And he said that if both of you, Ali and Uthman, are okay with this idea, allow me to take the final vote and I will choose between you two. And both of them agreed to this condition. And then so it is said that Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he talked to some other Sahaba as well, and to the people of Medina. And then he came back a little while later and he says that I choose Uthman. And then everyone that was at that meeting, including Ali radiallahu anhu, because some of the Shia, they have their own version of events. And honestly, in my lecture too, I'll be giving the Sunni view of events and everything that had occurred. And obviously I have reasons for it as well, including the fact that the Sunni traditions that are well documented and they have their chains of narration going back, inshallah. So it is said that everyone, they pledged their allegiance to Uthman radiallahu anhu. And so there were two main aspects of his Khilafah that I will mention. One is the preservation of the Quran. And even the Quran that we have today is called the Uthmani script. That is what it is known as. Because part of his Khilafah, majority of it, what we know is that it was dedicated to the preservation of the Quran. And then number two I have to mention is the fitna that happened and his subsequent assassination. And so to start was that some Sahaba, when the Ummah was expanding, people from many different parts of Arabia were becoming Muslim, and much farther away from Mecca and Medina. And so these areas, they didn't have Sahaba. And so the Prophet ﷺ, even during his lifetime, he sent Sahaba to teach them. And this is what we call da'wah. and tabligh, this is where they take their methodology as well. And so they would go to different parts and they would teach them how to recite the Quran. And it is said by some of the Sahaba that when they would go to these lands, they would be learning through different teachers. And they would go and they would realize that the people would sometimes, because of their dialect, they would recite in ways that were not true to the Quran. True to the Quran that the people of Mecca and Medina knew. So they would be making some mistakes in their reciting. And this was narrated by some of the Sahaba as well. And one of them was Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman radiallahu anhu. And to solve this issue and to quell any fighting before it began, because some of the tribes were saying, no, you're reciting Quran wrong. And then the other tribe would say, no, that you're reciting this Quran wrong. And so to avoid this conflict and to quell it before it began, Uthman radiallahu anhu wanted to unite the ummah under just one mushaf. And so he put in charge of this task Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu, and he became the head of this Quran preservation committee, you could call it, at the young age of 20. At the young age of 20 years old. And so what are some of the reasons he chose Zayd? One of them is that he had memorized much of the Quran at a very young age. So he is one of the Huffaz of the Quran, and he had memorized it at a very young age. And number two is that he became a Huffaz very quickly. It is said that he had such a memory that MashaAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed him that he would memorize very quickly. And he had an amazing memory as well. So much so that it is narrated that when the Prophet ﷺ would talk to the tribes of Arabia, and some of them were Jews, and they would talk in Hebrew, some of them. And he would get letters in Hebrew as well. But there was no one really amongst them who could translate the Hebrew into Arabic. And so the Prophet ﷺ went to Zayd ibn Thabit, and he said that learn the language of the Jews, of the Yahud, meaning Hebrew. And it is said that he learned how to read and write the language of Hebrew in just 2 weeks. That in 2 weeks he became fluent in their language, and then he would translate for the Prophet ﷺ. Another reason he was chosen was because he was present at the final reading of the Quran that the Prophet ﷺ did with Jibreel alayhi salam before he had passed away. And so part of them too was the third Zayd ibn Thabit. And even before he began this task, Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu, he has a narration, he says that moving a whole mountain would have been easier than this task which Uthman radiallahu anhu has given to me, because of the enormity of this task. And it was a rigorous process where multiple Sahaba, all of them Huffaz, would check a verse someone brought and would make sure that it was in the Quran. So when the Quran was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, he would tell the Sahaba, and they would write it on whatever they had. Whether it would be bone, whether it be leather, whatever they had, whether it be a hide. And so Zayd ibn Thabit, he said that whoever had that written down, he has to bring that material thing with the verse written on it to him, and then he would check it. And remember that he is a hafid. Not only that, but the person who brings the item, he would need 2 witnesses with him, who are present with the Prophet ﷺ and the person bringing the material. So 2 witnesses to say that this indeed is exactly the verse that was revealed at that time. And so after this, and then multiple other Huffaz would also make sure that this verse indeed was sent down to the Prophet ﷺ. And after this had been done, he ordered for all the other mushafs to be burned to maintain unity. And so why burn the mushafs? This is something that a lot of the non-Muslims, they bring up as well. Why burn the mushafs? Does anyone have any idea? You go ahead.
I just remember, so it stay clean. So you can't throw it in the garbage because then you never go because it was talking in the Quran. It's better to burn it than throw it away.
So yeah, as Yazid was saying, it is better to burn the Quran than to throw it in the trash or to do something else to it. And this is the way we are supposed to dispose of scripture, either bury it or burn it. And this isn't seen as a bad thing. This is a very Western idea that burning scripture, and this was started from the West as well. This is actually a virtue given to the Quran, that we don't allow someone to desecrate it. Because even if we cut it up, they could like tamper with it, they could do something with it, or they could change it in a different way. With burning, it leaves no trace of it. It leaves, basically, it's just ash, it turns into ash. So this is a virtue that is given to the Quran. And the other Sahaba, radiallahu anhu, none of them saw it as a bad thing as well. They all agreed that this is the best way to do things, to maintain unity amongst the Ummah. And look at the foresight of Uthman radiallahu anhu, that today the whole Muslim Ummah, even the different firqa that come out of Islam, all of them are united on just one mushaf. We don't have like a King James version of the Quran. We don't have like all these different versions like the Christians do. We have just one mushaf, and the whole ummah is united on that one mushaf. And this was the foresight, and this is also first and foremost because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that He Himself will preserve the Quran. And so this is one of the miracles of the Quran itself. And now we get to the fitna and the assassination of Uthman radiallahu anhu. This will be the final phase, inshaAllah. And before we get to the assassination, know that Uthman radiallahu anhu was already told by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he would die a shaheed, that he would die a martyr. And there were multiple narrations of this and multiple hadith narrated. I will mention one of them to you that is found in Bukhari. The Prophet ﷺ said that once he was climbing Mount Uhud with Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. And look, oftentimes it would be Abu Bakr and Umar with the Prophet ﷺ. And this is how many hadith would start. It would say that I, Abu Bakr and Umar. I, Abu Bakr and Umar. And in this hadith, after them, it is Uthman radiallahu anhu, showing how close all of them were. So it is said that he was climbing Mount Uhud with Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, and it began to quake, it began to shake and tremble with them on top of it. And then the Prophet ﷺ says, "Uthbut Uhud, فَإِنَّمَا عَلَيْكَ نَبِيٌّ وَصِدِّيقٌ وَشَهِدًا." He says that be still Uhud, for upon you is only a prophet, a Siddiq, and two shaheeds. So we know who the Prophet is. Who is the Siddiq? Yeah, Abu Bakr. And who are the two shaheeds? Yeah, Umar and Uthman radiallahu anhum. And so with the ummah spreading so far, honestly landed up in the Levant and further on, the Muslims, they ended up going exponentially. That because of the military conquests and the victories of the Muslims, the increase of the Muslims was exponential. And so while the number was going up, the fact remains that many of them were still new Muslims. They were not like the Sahaba. You see, the Sahaba to us, they're very special. They hold a very high status because of how they were and their hikmah, their wisdom, and how they were in terms of their religion. These new Muslims, they were not at the Sahaba level, and problems would come. And many of them were political problems. I'll say this, many of them were political problems, and they came with the governors in power in places like Kufa, in Egypt, and Basra. So a lot of political problems came up, and the people complained to Uthman radiallahu anhu as well that some of his policies were not to their liking. And they wanted him to resign. They came to Medina asking him to resign from his position. And know that it's not haram to go to a Sahaba. It's not wrong per se to go to a Sahaba and say that this is your policy, I disagree with your policy. Because this is something that is not related to religion. These are political disputes, and so they would come to him and they say that we don't like your policy in such and such a thing. And so some of the people came to Medina and they complained to him. However, this was separate because Uthman radiallahu anhu, he would listen to them and he would resolve their complaints. And they mentioned that there were a few Sahaba as well, Abu Dharr al-Ghafar and Ammar ibn Yasir, who had a few complaints. And Uthman radiallahu anhu, he would talk to them and the complaints would be solved, alhamdulillah. Other people would come who had recently become Muslim, and their complaints would be of another nature. And they would go extreme levels to the repercussions that they wanted to, and they would say to Uthman radiallahu anhu that justice, to make sure that these disputes are resolved, we want you to resign from your position as the Amir al-Mu'mineen, as the leader of the Muslims. And some of their complaints, they actually had a list, and each of them was actually answered. I'll just mention that at the top of their list was that they accused Uthman radiallahu anhu of nepotism, or putting those related to him in positions of power. And I'll mention why this is an unfounded claim. Because he put many different people, many different types of people in power. And these were not just people that were related to him. Even people who were formerly slaves, he even put them into positions of power. So this was not something that was specific to the family of Uthman radiallahu anhu. He would actually put many people in positions of power. Number two was that when it comes to nepotism, there is an aspect of goodness in it. An aspect, if it is done with the right intentions. And what is this? It is that you would want to put someone whom you know, someone whom you know very well, whom you can trust, in a position of power. And so this is what Uthman radiallahu anhu wanted to do. That he wanted to put someone whom he knew well. And who would this be except for his family? Because honestly, family at that time lived all close to each other. And so the people whom he could trust best was his family. And so that is why he would put them in positions where they would have the most amount of power. And number three, I will also mention, is that the Umayyads were always known to be great politicians and when it came to governance. So this was something not specific to the Umayyads, to his clan, but it is something that is found within their tribe. They were very good in governance. And so this is also another reason why he would choose amongst them to put in places of power. And something else was that his right-hand man, basically his wazir, or his chancellor as you could say, was Marwan ibn al-Hakam, who was related to him. I think he was his cousin, but he trusted him a lot and he had political acumen. And so it makes sense to put your right-hand man as someone whom you trust the absolute most. And to him, this happened to be his cousin. So what is wrong with this ideology? That you want to put someone whom you can trust in the position of the most power. And so later on as well, Marwan ibn al-Hakam, he will become a Khalifa, but this is beside the point, inshaAllah. Number two is that, so number one, their main thing was nepotism. Number two is that they came and they attacked his character. And number one, they said, was that he was not present at the Battle of Badr. And they attacked him for this. Now, why was this something that is just a really bad thing to say, to come at him for? Does anyone remember? Why he was not present at the Battle of Badr? Go ahead.
Because his wife was sick.
That's right, his wife Ruqayyah was sick. And the Prophet ﷺ himself had told Uthman, who had come ready with armor, that don't worry, take care of Ruqayyah, I want you to stay here. So who are these people who can come up to Uthman? Who do they think they are to tell him that why did you not participate in Badr? Number two is they said that you're someone who we do not respect because you fled at Uhud. Now why is this also something that doesn't make sense to say? Because he did turn his back, but still, why is this something that doesn't make sense? Go ahead.
Because Allah has forgiven those who turn their back.
That's right, because there is a verse in the Quran itself where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already forgiven him. So who are you to not forgive Uthman when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already forgiven all of those who turned their backs in that battle? And then the third thing, I'll probably stop the list with this, is that they said he was giving out large amounts of wealth to his family. And this brings it back to the nepotism point basically. But his reply was, and he replied to all of these complaints one by one by one. And to this he replied that they are my family. And this is not the Baytul Mal. This is not the treasury of the Muslims. This is my own wealth. So I can do with my wealth as I please. And I wish that I gift it to my family. And so this is his right, it's his money. So he has the right to give it to whomever he wants. And so he answered all of their points one by one. All of those who had come through the different lands and came in Medina to the house of Uthman. he answered all of their complaints one by one, and they had become somewhat satisfied. He said, okay, that we just want you to change our governor then. And their governor was in Egypt, and he said, fine, that I will change the governor who is in charge of you guys. And so, this is where the main problem starts. On their way back from Medina to Egypt, they find a messenger. And this messenger is carrying a secret document that has the seal of Uthman radiallahu anhu. So the seal of the Khalifa. And this is something that no one else would have. It is a seal, and the sealed document, it is an official letter from Uthman radiallahu anhu. And so they stop this messenger, this group of people, and they open the letter and read the contents of it. And it was addressed to the governor of Egypt, whom they were going back to. And the contents of the letter read that once this group of people reaches you, then they should all be killed. So this is what the letter said, and this is where the problem took the root. This is the source of the problem. Now before I go on, we need to address this, that there are three main hypotheses which are given in the books of history. Number one is that Uthman radiallahu anhu wrote this letter, and he was sending it to Egypt. And this one, we can immediately cross off the list, that it was not Uthman radiallahu anhu who wrote this letter. How do we know this? Because when news reached him, he said, Wallahi, he took an oath by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he never wrote it or had any knowledge of it. And so when a Sahaba is taking an oath by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we have to take it as fact. And so Uthman said that Wallahi, I never wrote this letter, nor have I any knowledge of it. Also, we know about his nature that he was very soft in nature. And this is why the Quraysh loved him. He was very soft, he was well-mannered, he was respected. And this was not in his nature to do something like this, where behind their back, he would sentence them to death without giving them a fair trial or anything. Number three is that he could have fought them at any time. When they came to Medina, the whole army was basically there, because this is the most heavily fortified city in basically Arabia. And so he could have ordered them at any time to take care of this group of people who had come to maybe start an uprising. But he didn't do that then. And then number four, if we just think logically, that why would he be sending a messenger along the same exact route that these rebels would be taking back to Egypt, and make it so that it was possible for this messenger to be caught? It's just because of all of these reasons, it just does not make sense that he would write this letter. And so what is another hypothesis given? It is that Marwan ibn al-Hakam, his cousin, wrote it. And many classical scholars of history actually write this and give this as the reason as well. And they say that his intention was not the best, but it was to help his cousin and the Amir al-Mu'minin Uthman. And he wanted to secretly get rid of these people who were trying to start an uprising. So he said, I'll just do this myself, because he would have access to the seal. So he would think to himself that I will just take care of this, so that there isn't a bigger problem in the future. However, this doesn't seem plausible as well, because he would have taken the blame when these rebels came to the house of Uthman radiallahu anhu, because they surrounded the house and Marwan was in the house. And he is someone who is said to be of good character as well, and the Sahaba would narrate this as well of him. So if this was truly the case, then he would take the blame and he would tell them that it was I who wrote the letter, but this did not happen. And so the last hypothesis, and this one seems to be the most correct, and it is the one I believe in as well, or whatever, take that with a grain of salt, but it is said that the letter was forged, which Uthman radiallahu anhu said that how often does this happen, that people will forge letters with the seal that is given of the Khalifa. He said, how often does this happen in other lands and other dynasties in history where so many of letters of this nature are forged to cause uprisings, to cause tumult between the Muslims, and to cause rebellions between the people. And so they turned their back, and they turned back from Egypt, and they had went to the house of Uthman radiallahu anhu, and they heard all of these points, but they didn't accept them. They said that we want someone to take the blame for this letter, that why is this being sent out? And so they put siege on the house of Uthman radiallahu anhu, And the scholars say that this siege took place for over 40 days. So for 40 days his house was on siege. And at times it cut off food and water, even though he had bought bi'r Ruman. So he had basically bought the water that the Muslims would drink from. And they deprived him from this. They deprived from food coming into his house, even though he had bought caravans of food for the Muslims during times of famine. And he was also prevented from going into the mosque of praying in it. And he was the one who even paid for the expansion of the mosque. So they're depriving him of all of these things, through which Uthman radiallahu anhu has helped the ummah. And he even asked them, he says that why are you trying to kill me? For what reason? Because you need a shara'i reason. You need a legal reason to kill someone. So he said, what is your reason in trying to assassinate me? Or trying to kill me? And they quoted a verse in the Quran. They said, أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ لَقَدِيرٌ. The permission to fight back is hereby granted to those being fought, for they have been wronged, and Allah is truly most capable in helping them prevail. And so they say that dhulm has been done to us, and so we are fighting you. And look at their ignorance in saying this. Because Uthman radiallahu anhu, a sahabi, he says that I was present when this verse even came down, and to whom it was revealed. And then he gave them the tafsir of this ayah. He said that it was revealed to the Muslims, allowing them to fight back against the Quraysh. And who are these ignorant people who think they can teach a sahabi what the Quran is and the interpretation of the Quran? And honestly, a lot of them were like this. These were basically the Khawarij. And the Sahaba narrate that amongst the people who put siege on the house of Uthman, we later saw them amongst the Khawarij. That these people who think they know what the Quran is, and they are not even Sahaba. They're recent converts. And so as things progressed, the rebels cut off food and water. And perhaps the most notable, I will say, is that even Ali radiallahu anhu, when he heard of this news, he tried his best to support. He tried his best to dissuade the people and support Uthman. And he sent both of his sons, fully armed, Hassan and Hussein, to go to the house of Uthman and protect him. And this is well recorded in the books of history. And I would even dare say, even the Shia, they would agree with this. That he sent both of his sons to protect Uthman radiallahu anhu. Same with Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu and Mughira ibn Shu'bah, who were Sahabi and they were old. They said, just give us one word. Just give us one word and we would bring in the whole army of Medina and take care of all of these rabble-rousers. Take care of all of these rebels. However, Uthman radiallahu anhu would not give them the word. Because he said that I will not be the first Khalifa who sheds the blood of a Muslim. And this basically became his main motto, his main reason for not fighting back. He said, I will not be the first Khalifa who draws blood amongst the Muslims. And this is why he did not fight back. And so Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, Talha ibn Ubaydullah, they all sent their sons to go and protect Uthman radiallahu anhu. And nearing the end, among the Sahabis that came was Abdullah ibn Umar. And knowing his fate that awaited him, Uthman, because you see Abdullah ibn Umar, he was a Sahabi and he had so much wisdom amongst the Sahaba. He was well respected even amongst them. And generally, the Abadilah, there's a group of Sahaba called the Abadilah, and they are known for their asceticism. And amongst them is Abdullah ibn Umar, because of how good they were in knowing about the hadith, about the Quran. Amongst them is also Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As and Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhum. So these are all part of the Abadilah. And so he asked for his mashwara. He asked for his advice. Even though he was younger than him, he still asks him for his advice. And look at the hikmah, look at the wisdom in his response. Abdullah ibn Umar says that if you give up your khilafah, wouldn't you still die? Wouldn't you still die at the end of the day? And isn't the worst that they can do is that they kill you? And Uthman radiallahu anhu replies that yes, that this is the worst they can do for me. And they cannot control whether you go to Jannah or whether you go to Jahannam. And then he says, yes, this is indeed the case. And then Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu replies that in that case, I do not believe that you should take off a garment Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed on you. Otherwise, it might set the precedent. And look, he is referencing the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he said, Allah may give you a garment and do not take that garment off of you. So he is referencing that hadith, and then he adds his own hikmah. He says, if you do this, it will set the precedent for all the future khalifas. And whenever some rebels come, they'll be like, okay, I'm stepping down. That this will set the precedent. So he said, hold on to your khilafah till the very end. And so, it is said that one night, Uthman radiallahu anhu ended up taking his advice. And it said that one night, Uthman radiallahu anhu saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a dream. And it is said that this happened after 40 days. And in the dream, he saw with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with the two who were most beloved to him, Abu Bakr and Umar. He saw them with him, wearing the clothes of Jannah. And the Prophet ﷺ sees Uthman and he says, Ya Uthman, aftir indana al-Layla. The O Uthman, break your fast with us tonight. Because during these 40 days, he had basically been fasting. Food and water was deprived of him. And so the Prophet ﷺ was saying in the dream that, O Uthman, break your fast with us today. And so Uthman on that day, it is said, and the books of history narrate this, that on that day, he woke up and the very first thing he did was he ate suhoor. So, because he intended to fast that day. So he ate suhoor, and then he went to his wife, Na'ila, and he told her what he had seen in his dream. He said that I saw the Prophet ﷺ with Abu Bakr and Umar, and they said to break the fast with them tonight. And so he told her this dream, and she began to cry. She said that this won't be the case, that you won't die. This is because of the love his wife had for him. She said that you won't die, this is just something that you saw in your dream. And she didn't want to believe him, but he said that no, I know this will come true. And I will finally be with those whom I love. Al-Ahibba. So he knew that this would be the day that he would die. And he narrates this to his wife Na'ila, that I saw again the Prophet ﷺ, Umar and Uthman wearing the clothing of Jannah. And then he says, those whom I love. Al-Ahibba. These are the people whom I love, and they are the ones whom I will be meeting later on. And he ordered in this, so this is still the morning. This is the morning still. He ordered all of the people in the house to leave. And so I told you the sons of Ali radiallahu anhu, the sons of Talha, of Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, they were all there fully armed. And some of them, the sons of Ali, it is said, I think it was Al-Hasan, even he had marks of injury because he had tried to fight back. He told all of them to leave the house that day. And they said, no, they will stay and protect you. But he said, I order you as the Khalifa over the Muslims, as the Amir al-Mu'mineen, and you cannot disobey the leader of the Muslims. And so because of this, they had to leave the house. And so they all left. And the rebels came in one by one. And one of them, and this might be the only problematic one, was Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, who was the son of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. And so him being there isn't a big problem. Why? Because number one, he is not a Sahaba. And while his father was basically the most virtuous amongst them, that does not immediately mean the son would be the most virtuous. And the scholars state that his son and his grandson were actually more virtuous than him. And they would become the leaders of hadith of their time. I think it was Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr. And so it is said that while he was not a Sahaba, when Uthman radiallahu anhu saw him, he said that, O Muhammad, how disappointed your father would be to see you with these people. He's saying this to Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr. And then after hearing this, the books of history state that even Muhammad, he left the premises. That he became full of guilt. That this is what Uthman radiallahu anhu is saying. That how disappointed your father would be seeing you with this group of people. And so Muhammad, he left the premises. And so we can say that he was not involved with the assassination of Uthman radiallahu anhu. And as the rebels came, know that none of them were Sahaba. And the famous Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah, he replies, he actually states in his books that he was in Medina, and at this time he was a teenager, and he reports that the only people who assassinated Uthman were the scum of the earth. People that no one would know, and people who held no value in society. That these were people were basically like the scum of the society. And so his wife came to protect him. And so she tried to shield Uthman when they came with their swords. And it is said that her fingers were cut. She held out her hand and they cut her fingers off. And then he was stabbed and killed. And before he passed away, it is said that they cut off his arm, his hand. And then he said that this was the hand that first wrote down the Quran. So this was Uthman radiallahu anhu. And after this, they stabbed and they killed him, causing the death of Uthman. And in front of him was the Mus'haf. Look how throughout his life he was known for being a man of the Quran. The Quran that we know today we call the Uthmani script. And he is also one of those who is known that he was one of those Sahaba who would recite the whole Quran in just one night. And this was a virtue that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given to him. It's basically a miracle that he had been given. And he was known for the Quran, and even when he passed away, it is known that the Quran was right in front of him, and the blood spilled onto the Quran, and we know that the Quran will testify for him on Yawm al-Qiyamah. And before the end, I'll mention to you one last narration. It is mentioned that after he passed away, Hassan radiallahu anhu, the son of Ali radiallahu anhu, he says that I saw my grandfather, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in a dream. And he was standing by the arsh, the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was the first time I ever saw him in a dream looking worried. And then Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu came behind him, and he placed his hand on the shoulder of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then came Umar behind him, and he placed his hand on the shoulder of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. And this was the day Uthman radiallahu anhu had passed away. And then shortly after, while he's still narrating the dream, he says, in the dream, Uthman radiallahu anhu came, and his face was full of blood, and his head was in his hands. And he is saying, the O Messenger of Allah, ask these people, for what sin did they butcher me like this? And so this is a dream that Hassan radiallahu anhu narrates later on, and it is narrated in al-Bidayah wa al-Nihaya. وأقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.